My friend and colleague Lynn Tribble, professor of English at the University of Connecticut in Storrs, right? After many years at the University of Dunedin in New Zealand. Lynn, as many of you know, has applied ideas of embodied, extended, distributed cognition to an extraordinary array of historical and literary and performance topics in her kind of home field of early modern studies and Shakespeare studies, but increasingly in a diverse array of art forms, performance and cultural history and religion and education, for example, too. There's a lot of new work on emotion and the senses that Lynn has been working on, and we're going to hear a bit of, I think, some greatest hits and some new work from Lynn today on affective atmospheres, place and memory on the early modern stage. Over to you.
Thank you, John. Okay, thanks everybody, and I've really enjoyed the conference so far, and especially talking to all of you about some of the great work you're doing. Today, I'm going to be talking about place and memory in Shakespeare's theater. So I hope you're ready for a little bit of Shakespeare in the afternoon. So memory and place intertwine in Shakespeare's theater on multiple levels, ranging from the geographical situation of the theater in London, the way that actors manage space and attention on the fly, mapping of theatrical space onto fictional space, theatrical space onto fictional place, the manipulation of memory and the audience at multiple temporalities, and relationships among affect, national identity, memory, and audience. I focus on the English theater towards the end of the 16th century, the 1580s and the 1590s. This is a pivotal moment in its history, because the first purpose-built theaters for playing are built in this period. As you can see from the map, or maybe not, but the theaters, this is London, the city of London, still as today, about a mile square. The theaters were built outside the boundaries. Up in the north side near Shoreditch Theatre in the Curtain, and of course the best known theatre because of its reproduction, the Globe down here in Southwark to the south. So the point here was to build theaters outside the regulatory space of the City of London, which was very hostile to theater. They viewed it as taking people's time and attention away from church services and making money and other kind of godly pursuits. So the area where Shakespeare's theater was situated, both to the north and then later to the south, was a place where you went to go to brothels, to see bear baiting, to see fencing exhibitions and other less savory forms of entertainment. So that kind of geographical landscape, I think, is important in thinking about some of the things that Shakespeare was doing here. So the idea was to position the theaters outside of this kind of regulatory reach. Now, the theater itself, comprises this complex ecosystem, enacting heterogeneous temporality, spatiality, and then importantly, coordination amongst these. Within the systems, the embodied performance of the actors exemplified rich polytemporal and polyspatial interactions distributed across bodily, affective, poetic, social, and cultural resources. Early modern theater both displayed and enacted forms of memory work, forms of engagement with the past on multiple simultaneous levels involving changing and disparate assemblages of disparate resources. So this is an ecologically oriented understanding, thinking about the theater as a cognitive ecosystem, thinking about playing across the system, which would include psychological methods, underpinning task dynamics, the ways that attention, perception, and memory are managed both by the players and the audience, physical environments, conventions for structuring and employing space, which is what I'm going to primarily be talking about today, and relationships between playing and audience space cognitive artifacts, such as parts and plots, which I'll talk about very briefly, technologies like sound, and most importantly, some social systems that underpin their work. It's important to realize this is not just an account of early modern theater, but this can be applied to any sort of form of theatrical activity. The question is just where are the parts distributed? Where is the work done? So I'm particularly interested today in this kind of interplace between memory work and place. The way that memory work is distributed across the work of the playwright. The playwright writes fictional space, the architectural space of the theater, the bodies of the actors, their gestures, and the media ecology through which the past was disseminated, and the audience's affective response. So just some background, place worked very differently on the early modern stage than in more representational theaters to which we might be accustomed. Shakespeare's plays and those of his contemporaries, particularly Christopher Marlowe, were known for their extravagant use of fictional space. For example, the setting of Antony and Cleopatra shuttles back and forth between Rome and Egypt about 30 times in the course of the play. Christopher Marlowe, in his plays, revels in naming the exotic locales that his characters inhabit. Now, the technologies, though, for realizing those fictive places on the space of the stage, of course, have changed dramatically, as well as the assumptions behind whether one should do so. So one example, if we go to the 19th century, this is what Edwin Kean thought you should do at the end of Midsummer's Night Dream, which is to reproduce exactly the way that he imagined the Athens of Theseus looked. And similarly, he did research into how artisans in ancient Rome or ancient Greece would have looked, and they made these extremely elaborate sets that were meant to place the audience very definitively. There were no question about where you were. Now, the cost of this was that you had to cut about half the play because Shakespeare's plays work in a fluid system where you were not moving enormous pieces of furniture often on the stage to show set. Today, of course, theater practitioners make very different sets of decisions about how they're going to place, how they're going to overlay that fictional space onto whatever space they have. But the work of that is done through an enormous amount of labor of set design and blocking. So modern productions, for instance, use these kind of cognitive tools. And if you've been in theater, might have used these. These are prompt books that this is for the Canadian Stratford Festival, but that essentially represent all of the movement across the stage, the way the actors are meant to stand in relationship to one another, where they're meant to move. Now, in practice, prompt books are probably more aspirational than they are archival in some ways, but nevertheless, this kind of labor needs to be done in part because I think I've lost that slide. At technical rehearsal, you have to integrate all these things. You have to integrate the way the actors are moving, the blocking into sound and music cues, and so forth. So a lot of this work of mapping movement takes place in advance and also through the process of rehearsal. You're not meant to arbitrarily move across the stage. That's meant to come out of particular ideas of motivation and so forth and where you're moving, but it's all within a set of constraints depending on the director and the artistic director's vision of set design. Now, in contrast, early modern players worked with a very different set of resources and constraints, cognitive artifacts and practices. I've discussed before in my work about the kind of cognitive load that they held, that players in this period were performing up to 6 different plays every week. And with relatively little time for formal rehearsal, and in contrast, of course, to modern productions, which will have something like 6 to 8 weeks of rehearsal. So in this kind of cognitive ecosystem, place was established on the fly using a kind of distributed system that, of course, includes the play itself, the lines, which establish place through dialogue and occasionally stage directions. It's also possible that they used occasional signs that might say Athens. We don't really know for sure. Another artifact that was used was the plot. As I've written before, Shakespeare's players had only their own parts in cues. They did not have copies of the entire play. But another thing that they used to navigate the space, the theater, theatrical production itself, was something called a plat, which about this size. It hung backstage, and these lines represent scenic units. And occasionally they will be sort of some place indicators that need to be brought on the stage. This one reads, "A tent being placed on the stage for Henry VI, he in it asleep." So the tent is meant to stand in for the army's preparations before a battle. That helps to establish some forms of place. So in this example, the tents on the stage represent a soldier's encampment. Now the stage isn't bare, as is sometimes said. It's actually full. It's filled with people, costumes, props, movables like this tent, and working in a space that I think becomes marvelously mutable as architectural space is mapped onto the fictional space of the play. This is just a slide of the cues that they used. As you can see, so an actor would have his lines and then one or two words that would be spoken to him by whom you necessarily know, but it allowed this kind of stripped down sort of information underload. You only learn. If you're the boy playing Ophelia, you don't need to know about Fortinbras, right? You're never in the same space. So it kind of facilitated memory. It also was a system in which actors would map their bodies onto the parts through the use of gesture, which was a highly sophisticated technology or bodily technology in this period. So the way space works, you can see through this slide, is by actors transforming the stage architecture that's relatively fixed. This is from the Globe. These players performed in different kinds of spaces. They didn't always have pillars. They might perform actually in a setting like this with a screen behind them for offstage and two doors only. So they had to be fluid, but nevertheless, the space would then be kind of mapped on the fly from the fiction, from the theatrical place into the fictional, theatrical space into the fictional place. So you can see here, this is from Romeo and Juliet. This is a drawing by Walter Hodges. So you have Benvolio and Mercutio looking, this takes place just after Romeo has seen Juliet for the first time. And Benvolio and Mercutio are looking for him. And they basically say, he's ran this way and leapt this orchard wall. He hath hid himself among these trees, and you see him peeking out from behind the column. That these fictional spaces get mapped onto theatrical place very fluidly and quickly. And it's done in part through gesture. You can see that through here, just gesturing. And this was something that was, again, seen as a very important part of one's bodily sort of skills. The doors you see on the illustration may well have been larger and seem to have operated somewhat relationally, with one representing kind of further in and the other further out. In Hamlet, say for instance, one door would lead to the interior of the castle further in, another door to the battlements where he's going to meet the ghost, and you have to maintain some kind of consistency on the fly as you do that, because otherwise the audience can become confused. But you also have to so the audience needs to acquiesce, but it also needs to forget. Because just 5 minutes before, this space was the ballroom where Romeo and Juliet were meeting, and you have to be able to forget that and turn it back into the space, both horizontal that you see here, and then, of course, the most famous vertical space probably in Shakespeare, the balcony in Romeo and Juliet. So it's kind of it's been described as a kind of wipe and reset dialectic, as you're constantly being kind of brought into to the fictional space and then be encouraged to forget it. And so the gestures of the players, the movements of their bodies, the dialogue, establishes an evanescent fictional setting that prompts the audience to say forget, and then be invited into yet another space. So architectural space seems like a kind of constant, but it's actually a little bit soft around the edges. And I think in a longer version of this talk, I talk a little bit about affordances, about the way that spaces invite you to do certain things, and the way that skillful and thoughtful inhabitation of movement of these kind of spaces over time. I'm interested, for instance, in how this works in the New Globe, might reveal the kind of affordances and constraints of the stage. So these practices demand skill on the part of the audience, of the actors, but also skill and also willingness on the part of the audience itself. I'll just skip this. Famously, Sir Philip Sidney resented the requirement to make these kinds of fluid, on-the-fly imaginations. He's writing in the early 1580s, giving a defense of poetry, but the one end talking about the greatness or potential greatness of English poetry, but also his disappointment with English drama, because he believed that English drama should follow classical precepts of the unity of time, place, and action, so that everything takes place in the same space within a time period roughly equivalent to the time of the play. Shakespeare's and the other playwrights at the time were really not interested in that particular way of imagining space. So Sidney writes, complaining, say, "You shall have Asia on one side of the stage and Africa on the other, and so many under kingdoms, that the player, when he comes in, must ever begin by telling us where he is, or else the tale will not be conceived. Now you shall have 3 ladies walk to gather flowers, and then we must believe the stage to be a garden. By and by we hear news of a shipwreck in the same place. Then we are to blame if we accept it not for a rock. Upon the back of that comes out a monster with fire and smoke, and then the miserable beholders are bound to take it for a cave. While in the meantime 2 armies fly in, represented with 4 swords and bucklers, and then what hard heart will not receive it for a pitched field?" So this is a deliberate refusal of that kind of game that that Shakespeare's and his other playwrights are really playing with the audience. You agree to believe this. Famously, Shakespeare actually has a riposte to this kind of to this critique, and I'm going to be talking actually for the rest of the talk about this idea of the 4 swords and bucklers, the idea of a pitch battles, history, kind of the scope of history taking place within the sort of confines of the stage. In Henry V, and by the way, I'm going to be talking about Henry V as well as the Henry VI plays, and so I'm apologizing for advance for the really outrageous English jingoism that against the French that you're going to be hearing. So, désolé, it's just the way it is. So Henry V is, lives in kind of English imagination as, the high point of the English domination of France, the Victory Agincourt, in which a small band of English archers defeats a massive French army. Shakespeare, in writing this play, which comes towards the end of his interest in history plays, in one version of his text adds a chorus that begins by asking or apologizing, apparently, I'll talk about that in a sec, for the visual poverty of the spectacle. "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sore, and fire crouch for employment." So you have this inflation and then the deflation. "But pardon, gentles all, that the flat, unraised spirits that hath dared on this unworthy scaffold," to this reference to where they are now, "to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Can this small space hold this empire? Or may we cram within this wooden O?" So this is this may have been the first play performed at the Globe, so he's making a reference to that moment. "May we cram within this wooden O the very cast that did affright the air at Agincourt. Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure," so here's the math, "may attest in a little place 1,000,000, and let us ciphers to these great account on your imaginary forces work. Suppose within the girdle of these walls are to confine two mighty monarchies, whose high upreared and abutting fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts, into 1,000 parts divide one man and make imaginary puissance. Think when you talk of horses that you see them printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth, for 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, jumping o'er time, and so on. So there's one of these at the beginning of each act. And the critics have debated the implications of this. Many people thought these are elaborate excuses, that Shakespeare was really waiting for Technicolor to come around so that you could have, something like Olivia's Henry V and really show Agincourt. In fact, Agincourt is not shown at all in the entire play. But I don't really think that. I think almost all of Shakespeare's apologies are boasts, that this is actually does not reflect anything that I would call a theatrical anxiety or disenchantment with the visual resources of his theater. But if any, they are a form of boasting. That the chorus says, so skillful are my actors, so vivid is my writing, so easily will you yield to our suggestions, that we can lay bare all our devices, that we can tell you these are just a bunch of guys with rusty swords, but you will still cheer St. Crispin's Day. You will leave the theater with the impression you've seen the Battle of Agincourt, but I haven't shown it to you at all. And so that it's a way of saying, of talking about the kind of audience work and the kind of actor work that kind of goes into establishing place in this play. I won't really talk about this much, but it's a very Shakespearean thing, because at the end he reminds us that now you've seen all this, Henry V's son is Henry VI, and he loses France almost immediately. just so. I want now to move towards the end of the talk to the question of sort of national memory and where this plays in. So the new theater of Elizabethan London was especially notable in affording productive technologies for manipulating temporality and spatiality. The theaters of the 1580s and 1590s were dominated by history plays. In fact, Queen Elizabeth commissioned an all-star company of the best actors at the time, whose main job was to go around the country touring, showing plays about English chronicle history, including Henry V, Richard III, King John, and King Lear, which you may recognize as plays that Shakespeare later stole for his own writing. So Sidney's jibe at the four actors with bucklers standing in for a pitched battle is particularly relevant to this element of memory work on Shakespeare's stage. And as we saw when I showed you the map, theater going was by no means considered a kind of legitimate activity, so its role in transmitting the past and shaping a national identity becomes a key point made by its defenders. So in Pierce Penniless, Thomas Nash, who may actually have written part of Henry VI, defends playgoing. He says, the afternoon is the idlest time of day, during which men that are their own masters seek pleasurable pastimes like gaming, whoring, and drinking, and playgoing. And playgoing is the best of these. That's what you should be doing, because it's a rare exercise of virtue, because, he says, the subject of plays is borrowed out of our English chronicles, wherein our forefathers' valiant acts that have lived long buried in rusty brass and worm-eaten books are revived, and they themselves raised from the grave of oblivion and brought to plead their aged honors in open presence. He goes on, how would it have joyed brave Talbot, the terror of the French, to think that after he had lain 200 years in his tomb, he should triumph again on stage and have his bones new embalmed with the tears of 10,000 spectators at least at separate times, who in the tragedian that represents his person imagine that they behold him fresh bleeding. So Talbot is the hero of Henry VI Part 1, who dies in Act 4 and is well, you can sort of see why he's so valuable. He's how Shakespeare and Nash present him. He's very busy. He's scales walls. He's chases the French leap over their walls in the shirt. The English fly, leaving the French fly, leaving their clothes behind, etc. So Talbot has a very active role in this play, and his death and the death of his son in Act 4 was an extraordinarily affective moment for the audience. The tears embalm him. In fact, Talbot died 20 years after the events that Shakespeare's chronicling. So in fact, this is not actual history. This is myth making. So liberated both from worm-eaten books and neglected brass monuments, the theater stages his triumph and his death. The complex operation of temporality shuttles from the subjects of chronicle history, released from the grave of oblivion, to the separate moments of staging before the spectators, who paradoxically both reinter him and bring him back to life. And Nish does remain very aware of the historical figure, the tragedian, that represents his person. So I think descriptions of this point to a kind of material, social, technological, and temporal webs of social cognition. So the skill of the player is knitting audience and players together through these kind of lines of force generated by the ability of actors to embody and communicate passion in a lively portrayal. This is a well-known description of what the actor can do. By a full and significant action of body, the actor charms our attention. Sit in a full theater, and you think you see so many lines drawn from the circumference of so many ears, while the actor is at the center. So the body of the actor insistently holds and reveals the kind of multiple times and spaces of the theater. And this level of embodiment is notable not just for its containment within the boundary of the skin, but for its contagious qualities, its ability to move, bewitch, and fashion spectators. How am I doing on time? Yep. So one way of thinking, one way that I've been trying to think about this is through the idea of affective atmosphere, particularly through some of the work of Joel Kruger, who writes that atmospheres are tied to the world. They're rooted in features of the natural and built environment, but they're always relational. Bits of the world may be configured in ways that are poised to potentially generate atmospheric experiences, but they only arise if subjects are present and poised to potentially engage in them in some way. So that's one of the things I'm interested in, is that presence and ability to engage. So thought of this way, atmospheres are the product of labor, albeit of a kind that's not always easy to specify. Again, Kruger, an atmosphere is never exclusively a psychological phenomenon, a state of mind, nor solely an objective thing out there. Hovering between structure and agency, atmosphere could be a productive category for thinking through the affective and emotional ecologies of the early modern stage. I want to conclude by thinking very briefly about the kind of memory that Nash's account of Talbot presents for us. We often distinguish between, of course, episodic memory and semantic memory, knowing something that you've experienced and something that you know, you're taught in school. So 200 years after his death, of course, no one in the audience actually remembers the death of Talbot, which of course didn't even happen in the way they're supposed to remember it. But the event could remain within active or communicative memory, which historians describe as these periods in which maybe your grandfather's grandfather lived in a village, the oldest guy in their grandfather's village was at the battle and could tell you about it. So that there's a different kind of phenomenology, perhaps, in that way of thinking about memory. But the labor of the actor in the audience kind of creates a highly vivid affective atmosphere that kind of layers space and time that might kind of make that relationship between simply knowing that and sense of vivid experience. This is a kind of argument that Marcus was making a couple of days ago about imagining the difference between a vicarious or actually questioning the difference between vicarious and episodic memory. Because witnessing Talbot's death is highly emotive, audiences, even scattered temporally at several times, are folded across time and place, from the French battlefield 200 years prior to the play to the stage itself. And so the place of the stage can be the formation of a memory community through effective ties produced between actor and audience. And just to conclude, you think about, oops, I don't know what happened there. Just to conclude, if you think about where that audience was, as you can see, if you've ever been to the New Globe in London, the cheapest and really best seats are standing. You know, for £5 or £10, you can stand. So if you imagine, if instead of you guys sitting here, you were all around me in the kind of horseshoe formation, standing, there would be a different kind of relationship. And that relationship of this kind of circular environment where it allows this kind of affective contagion to work through is something I think that Shakespeare sort of is playing with and actually plays with throughout his plays. And one final example in Julius Caesar, where this is something Shakespeare makes up himself when Brutus is about to read the will of Julius Caesar. Anthony is about to read the will of Caesar. He says, come around and stand in a ring to the plebeians he's trying to get to riot. And it's at that moment when they come around and stand him in a ring, just as the people that are watching the play and in the Globe are standing around the actor, it is that moment that the emotional energies, in this case kind of rage, are unleashed. And so I think Shakespeare, working in a theater that had the potential anyway for unleashing that kind of affective energy, was very aware, wrote his plays in a way that kind of thought through some of these sorts of affordances of actor-audience interaction. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.